Hey everyone, tonight we're delving into a topic that's both scholarly and a bit provocative: the complicated, often misunderstood, and sometimes downright strange world of sexuality in medieval times. This was a period filled with codes of chivalry, suspicious herbal brews, and a whole lot of awkwardness. In those days, foreplay might have consisted of politely asking permission and silently praying no one was watching. Before we dive into this awesome topic, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're really enjoying the vibe. Alright, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see how far this little community reaches. Now, set the mood, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's ease into this unusual historical journey together. Let us start by putting to rest a major misconception. Medieval intimacy did not play out beneath luxurious sheets with candlelight flickering and soft music playing. The truth is far less romantic. Most people lived in tiny, cramped homes, typically one-room dwellings shared with children, elderly family members, and often livestock like goats, pigs, or a few loud chickens. Privacy, in the modern sense, was practically unheard of. A single room functioned as kitchen, bedroom, and barn all at once. Couples had to get creative when it came to carving out a moment alone. Timing was key, as was silence. Ideally, the kids would be asleep, turned toward the wall, and the animals, if present, wouldn't be staring. Even wealthier households, with multiple rooms, often lacked true solitude. Servants might be sleeping nearby or quietly pretending not to notice what was happening. In noble estates, records were sometimes kept about who slept where, mainly for religious or legal reasons. Yes, just as awkward as it sounds, traveling didn't help either. Inns often had shared sleeping arrangements, so it wasn't unusual to find yourself in bed next to a total stranger. If you were married and fortunate enough to have a clean bed and a bit of straw for comfort, you might just manage a quiet moment. But for the unmarried, discretion was essential. Word spread fast in tightly knit communities, sometimes faster than disease, and in monasteries or convents. There was no privacy, no distractions allowed, and certainly no whispered chats after dark. Still, rules could bend. The existence of tall walls around abbeys wasn't just for show. Religious institutions, particularly the church, had an overwhelming influence on how people in the Middle Ages viewed sex. And to put it simply, the church wasn't very enthusiastic about anyone enjoying it. The official stance was that sex was strictly for the purpose of reproduction, nothing more. Pleasure, suspicious at best, sinful at worst. Even within the confines of marriage, acts considered to be purely for enjoyment were heavily criticized. The missionary position was deemed acceptable because it reflected a sense of order and submission to divine design. Everything else was considered suspect. Theologians and clerics wrote detailed guides, some disturbingly specific on what was forbidden. These were not vague ideas. They included lengthy lists that described exactly which behaviors were off limits. Some of the entries are so oddly detailed that it seems likely they were inspired not just by scripture, but by real-life confessions or observations. They aim to regulate not just the body, but also the mind, controlling thoughts, desires, and fantasies. The concept of mutual pleasure or emotional connection between partners was rarely emphasized. Instead, it was all about discipline, restraint, and performing one's sacred duty. Still, as always, human nature didn't change. People bent the rules, sometimes in secret, sometimes more boldly, and the very existence of these detailed prohibitions hints at how often they were broken. Despite the church's strict regulations, not everyone in the medieval world viewed pleasure through such a grim lens. In fact, medical texts of the time written by learned men and occasionally copied by monks offered a more nuanced take on sexuality. Some even suggested that regular intimacy within marriage was healthy, especially for men. According to certain physicians, abstaining for too long could cause various ailments, including melancholy, headaches, or an imbalance of humors. For women, it was a bit more complicated. While female desire was acknowledged, it was often portrayed as something wild, dangerous, and in need of control. Many believed that women were naturally more lustful than men, a belief that both fascinated and terrified male writers. Female pleasure was rarely prioritized, but ironically, it was sometimes used as justification for male infidelity. If a wife was considered frigid or uninterested, it was seen as a possible reason for a husband to stray, though the opposite was never excused. This double standard appeared in literature, folklore, and even legal codes. Adultery committed by women was harshly punished. While male offenders often faced little more than social gossipings, they crossed into forbidden territory. such as seducing a noble's wife or violating church vows. Prostitutes, meanwhile, were paradoxically both condemned and tolerated. Cities designated special districts for brothels, often under strict regulation, and taxes were collected from their operation. What's the logic behind it all? Better to contain sin than let it spread unchecked. The church sometimes even blessed this arrangement by preaching that regulated vice prevented worse crimes. Yet the women working in these establishments were frequently marginalized and exposed to violence, disease, and social scorn. Still, not all stories were tragic. There were moments of tenderness, laughter, and genuine affection that survived despite the restrictions. Couples wrote love letters, exchanged tokens, and even eloped when social class or family disapproval stood in the way. Romantic poetry flourished, especially among the nobility, where troubadours sang of courtly love and idealized, often unattainable form of passion that praised devotion over physicality. Though these songs often excluded the realities of peasant life, they hinted at the universal longing for connection and emotional depth, even in an age obsessed with rules and appearances. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, is another major factor that shaped medieval intimacy, and not in a flattering way. Unlike the scented baths of ancient Rome or the personal grooming routines we have today, cleanliness in the Middle Ages was often inconsistent and dictated by social status, weather, and superstition. While public bathhouses did exist, especially in larger cities, their reputation gradually deteriorated. Originally intended for hygiene and even community gathering, many of these spaces eventually gained a reputation as places of illicit behavior. As a result, some church leaders condemned them altogether, leading to closures and public suspicion. By the later Middle Ages, many bathhouses were viewed as sinful both spiritually and physically due to the fear of immorality and spreading disease. This shift meant that regular bathing became less common, particularly in rural areas. Most people might have gone weeks or even months without a proper bath. The wealthy had more access to water, perfumes, and linens, but even then, standards were far from modern expectations. Teeth cleaning was rudimentary at best, involving twigs, cloth, or salt. Hair was rarely washed, and instead, it was often braided or covered. Body odor was simply a part of life, and people adapted to it. Lovers likely grew accustomed to one another's scent, though that doesn't mean the experience was especially pleasant. Fragrances such as rosewater or herbal sachets were sometimes used to mask the stronger smells, especially among the upper class. Still, a romantic encounter in the medieval world probably came with its share of sensory challenges. Clothing added to the situation. Garments were heavy, layered, and not easily removed. Undergarments were minimal or non-existent for many people. The concept of lingerie or seductive attire as we think of it today simply didn't exist. Most people slept either naked or in long shifts, and the idea of undressing for intimacy was less about romance and more about practicality, especially in cold seasons where warmth took priority. All of this contributed to an atmosphere where passion had to contend with a number of physical inconveniences. From shared spaces and strong smells to uncomfortable bedding and stiff garments. Yet, despite it all, people still found ways to connect, desire, and seek comfort in one another's arms, reminding us that intimacy, in any era, is as much about human resilience as it is about romance. Let us now address the idea of virginity and how it was treated in the medieval mindset, especially when it came to women. Virginity wasn't just a personal state of being, it was a symbol, a currency, a marker of value, particularly in the case of noble or royal marriages. A woman's worth, honor, and future prospects were often tied directly to her ability to prove she was untouched before marriage. This emphasis wasn't purely cultural, it had legal, religious, and financial weight. Marriage contracts could be annulled if a bride was found not to be a virgin, and family reputations could rise or fall on the basis of this singular detail. Physical evidence was sometimes demanded, most infamously, the presence of blood-stained sheets after the wedding night. While we now understand that such proof is medically unreliable, at the time, it was treated as sacred truth. In some cases, failure to produce this expected sign led to public humiliation, annulments, or even violence. Entire communities might get involved in judging the legitimacy of a union based on gossip or physical signs, whether real or fabricated. Midwives were occasionally called upon to inspect or certify virginity in invasive and practice steeped in shame and control, and while men were theoretically encouraged to remain chaste before marriage, this expectation was rarely enforced with the same vigor. Male experience was often overlooked, excused, or even praised. creating an unbalanced cultural landscape where purity was demanded from one gender and dismissed in the other. In literature and folklore, virgins were often portrayed as pure, delicate, and morally superior, but also naive and passive. They were prizes to be won, symbols of untouched perfection. This created a paradox. Women were expected to be innocent, yet ready for marriage, modest, yet desirable. Navigating these expectations was no small feat, especially for those who had little control over their own destinies. Arranged marriages were common, love was a luxury, and many women were married off while still in their early teens. Their bodies became battlegrounds for honor, alliances, and religious ideals. Yet even within such constraints, stories persist of women who found ways to assert agency, whether by delaying marriage, escaping unions, or engaging in discreet relationships outside the system. These acts, while rare, reveal that even in an era ruled by rules, the human spirit still found moments of quiet rebellion. Let us now turn to contraception and how medieval people attempted to control reproduction. Because despite the Church's warnings and the lack of scientific knowledge, methods did exist. Many of these were based on folk medicine, herbal remedies, and superstitions passed down through generations. Some herbs were believed to prevent pregnancy if taken before or after intercourse. Plants like pennyroyal rue and silpharum, though long extinct by the medieval period, were commonly cited in ancient texts and echoed in medieval herbal guides. However, the effectiveness of these methods was highly questionable, and the dosage often bordered on dangerous. In some cases, the same herbs believed to prevent conception could also induce miscarriage or cause poisoning. There was no reliable system of regulation or understanding of side effects. Everything was trial and error, whispered advice, and hope. Barrier methods, though rare, were not entirely unknown. Early versions of condoms existed, though they were crude, typically made from animal intestines or linen soaked in chemicals. These were primarily used to prevent the spread of disease, rather than pregnancy, particularly in urban areas where venereal infections were common. Withdrawal was another commonly mentioned method, although it was not widely approved by religious authorities. In fact, many church leaders viewed any act that deliberately avoided conception as sinful, regardless of intent or technique. Even within marriage, avoiding pregnancy could be seen as a challenge to divine will. Despite all of this, people continued to seek ways to control their fertility, especially women, who bore the risks and consequences of childbirth in a time when maternal mortality was high. Childbirth was dangerous, painful, and often fatal. Large families were idealized, but the physical toll was immense. It's no surprise then that women relied on community knowledge, midwives, and old remedies to try to protect themselves. These practices existed in a gray area, tolerated in private, but condemned in public. Some midwives were praised for their skill, while others were accused of witchcraft for the very same knowledge. The fine line between healer and heretic could be crossed with a single accusation. Through all this, what is clear is that the people of the Middle Ages were not as naive or uninformed as we sometimes assume. They worked with what they had, experimented, and passed along knowledge as best they could. While the results were inconsistent and the dangers real, their attempts reveal a deep understanding of human desire, risk, and survival in a world that offered few safe choices. Sexuality in medieval times wasn't just about private acts, it was deeply entwined with social structure, law, and power. In feudal societies, everything, including bodies and relationships, could be tied to hierarchy and control. Lords held authority not only over land but sometimes over the intimate lives of those who lived on it. One notorious example is the concept of droit du seigneur, or the Lord's right, a supposed custom where a noble could claim sexual access to a peasant bride on her wedding night. While historians debate how often or even whether this actually occurred, the fact that it appeared in folklore and literature reveals a deep awareness of how power could override consent, whether symbolic or real. Such ideas reinforce the notion that certain people's bodies were less their own than someone else's property. In some communities, sex was regulated by local courts. Fornication, adultery, and even flirting could be punished, sometimes by fines, public penance, or humiliation rituals like parading through town, wearing a sign, or having one's head shaved. The church enforced many of these rules through ecclesiastical courts, which focused on moral behavior. While these courts couldn't impose death sentences, they wielded immense influence, and confession became a tool not just for spiritual cleansing, but for social surveillance. People were encouraged to confess not only their own sins, but the behaviors of neighbors or relatives, making privacy nearly impossible. Same-sex relationships were also condemned, particularly among men, though historical records revealed that such relationships did exist. Some were romantic, others physical, and many occurred within the confined spaces of monasteries or among close male friendships. Laws against sodomy were harsh and often used selectively, depending on status and visibility. Among women, same-sex intimacy was less frequently documented, partly because it was always understood or even acknowledged by male authorities. However, certain legal texts and ecclesiastical writings do mention female same-sex acts, often with confusion, ridicule, or fear. These references, although rare, suggest that people were more aware of sexual diversity than official doctrine allowed. In this climate, secrecy became essential for anyone whose desires didn't fit the expected mold. Whispered relationships, coded gestures, and careful behavior were necessary not just for reputation, but for survival. Even when punishment wasn't enforced, the threat of shame or exile was often enough to keep people silent. And yet, the persistence of such relationships, despite risks, is a testament to how human desire finds expression even in the most repressive environments. Now let's talk about public punishment and how sexuality could be turned into spectacle. In the Middle Ages, moral transgressions weren't always dealt with behind closed doors. Quite the opposite, many societies made a point of turning punishment into performance. If someone was caught committing adultery, fornication, or any act deemed sexually deviant, they could be subjected to public humiliation. This might include being paraded through town in shameful clothing, placed in stocks while being mocked or pelted, or forced to undergo a ritual confession in front of the congregation. These events served two purposes: to punish the offender and to reinforce societal norms through fear and spectacle. Women were especially vulnerable to such treatment. Accusations of sexual misconduct, whether true or not, could damage a woman's reputation irreparably. Once labeled as impure, she might be shunned, denied marriage, or pushed into prostitution. Even in cases where men were equally guilty, it was the woman who bore the brunt of social blame. The threat of exposure hung constantly over women's heads, especially those without male protection or high status. In this way, public shame became a tool of control, weaponized to preserve the status quo and suppress rebellion or desire that didn't conform to expectations. Sometimes, this punishment extended beyond social ridicule to physical pain. Floggings, brandings, and even mutilation could be imposed, depending on local law and severity of the so-called offense. These weren't rare occurrences, they were designed to be witnessed and remembered. The medieval world didn't shy away from using the body as both the site and the symbol of judgment, through pain, shame, and public spectacle. Societies reinforced religious and cultural ideals, making it clear that stepping outside the lines had consequences, not just in the next life, but in this one too. Yet even with such brutal systems in place, people still risked it. Affairs happened. Forbidden love existed. Rules were broken. That fact alone speaks volumes. Despite all efforts to regulate human behavior, intimacy remained unpredictable, unruly, and, above all, deeply human. Art and literature of the medieval period give us another glimpse into how people thought and fantasized about sex. While official church teachings emphasized restraint, many popular stories and illustrations revealed a far more playful, sometimes explicit, imagination. Manuscripts from the era, especially marginalia, those strange little drawings in the margins of religious texts, occasionally featured, shockingly, scenes: rabbits wielding weapons, monks in compromising positions, and other surreal or erotic imagery weren't necessarily meant to be taken literally, but their very presence suggests a subversive sense of humor and a willingness to explore taboos, even on the edge of sacred pages. Courtly literature often danced around desire using symbolism and allegory. A knight might lay siege to a lady's heart, or a garden might represent hidden pleasures. Poets used coded language to express longing, frustration, or lust, especially in a world where direct expression could be dangerous. These works walked a fine line between flirtation and respectability, offering emotional release in an otherwise rigid social structure. Among the nobility, the culture of courtly love celebrated unconsummated passion as the highest form of devotion. But behind all the lofty metaphors, it's clear that desire pulsed beneath the surface, regardless of rules. Even religious art wasn't completely free of sensuality. Some depictions of saints and angels, especially female figures, carried an idealized beauty that blurred the line between spiritual admiration and physical attraction. There were sermons warning about lustful thoughts inspired by sacred images, proof that people struggled with temptation even in places of worship. Artists and audiences alike recognized the power of the human form, and they didn't always pretend otherwise. So while the official narrative condemned sexual expression, the artistic record tells a more complex story. It reveals a medieval world where imagination and desire persisted, sometimes hidden, sometimes playful, and often just barely restrained. People joked, fantasized, and created, even under the watchful eye of religion and authority. In that tension between repression and expression, we find not just history, but humanity. And now, as we come to the end of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what all of this tells us, not just about the past, but about ourselves. The medieval world was filled with contradictions, a culture that demanded purity but overflowed with desire, a society that preached restraint yet recorded countless exceptions, and institutions that sought to control the body while being endlessly fascinated by it. Despite harsh rules, public shaming, and religious condemnation, people still loved, yearned, experimented, and defied expectations. They found ways to connect in secret, to joke about forbidden things, and to pass down knowledge that wasn't always approved but was often essential. Sex in medieval times wasn't some exotic, distant ritual. It was messy, complicated, joyful, painful, dangerous, and deeply human, just like it is today. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. Across centuries, continents, and empires, we remain linked by the same drives and vulnerabilities. We laugh at the same absurdities, struggle with the same questions, and bend the same rules. The details change, the taboos shift, but the core remains. If this topic fascinated you as much as it did me, let me know in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts, your favorite moments, or even what surprised you the most. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next late night deep dive into the strange, the forgotten, and the deeply human corners of history. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.